Sparrow will come back on stage, and they will discuss the historical legacy of Brent Scowcroft at the NSC.
So, gentlemen, our task is to address the legacy. Been a lot of hints, suggestions, implications on that front already, but we'd welcome each of you making your own assessment of that. Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. It's a pleasure to have the much coveted visceral pooling slot on the schedule. The last panel between the audience and the cocktail hour. So let me make some brief remarks on the general theme of Brent Scowcroft and realism. And I just want to begin by saying it's terrific to be back here at the Bush School. I had 4 very happy years here. 4 of them spent, we were hired the same year, right, Jeff? So 4 together. And there were just so many things about being part of the Bush School that were really terrific, working under Chuck Herman's light and directive hand being not the least of those. But getting to know former President Bush, although there are now 2 former President Bushes, so I prefer the good Bush and the bad Bush. Did I say that? Actually, I had a long-regarded George H.W. Bush as the beau idée of American national security strategists. I actually cast my first vote, when I could vote, in the Republican primary for 41. And when it turned out that he did not get the nomination but was on the ticket, I was reassured that there was a steady hand on the Reagan administration, so I voted for him as well, knowing that 41 was behind him. And it was also a great time to be at Texas A&M. Bob Gates was the president of the university. Of course, Gates was legendary for his performance in government. In fact, I was honored to hold the Gates chair, although it was a dubious honor to have the boss's name on the chair and know that if you did something that embarrassed him, he was likely to find out about it. But it was Brent Scowcroft who was the person that I'd always regarded as the sort of person, if I could recreate my own career, that I would be him. He was a military officer and had a quite distinguished career. He had a PhD, which is a good thing, I think. And he was National Security Advisor not once but twice for 2 administrations. Indeed, I have to confess, Jason talked about somebody having a man crush. I had a bit of a bromance on Brent Scowcroft for a lot of my younger days. And in fact, when I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I lived across the hall from John Scowcroft, who was one of the general's nephews. And this was in the early 1980s, and there were a bunch of us who were aspiring national security wonks. And John confessed that General Scowcroft was coming to town, and they were going to dinner. And we all did our best to try to get included in the dinner invitation, which of course didn't work out. And so I had to wait till I came to the Bush School to finally meet him. But in addition to admiring his long and distinguished career in public service, which Bat lays out beautifully in his fine book, there was another reason that I found General Scowcroft in particular to be a very attractive political figure, and that's that I felt something of an intellectual kinship with him. For me, Brent Scowcroft was the acme of the realist foreign policy policymaker. Now, I want to, be quick to say I don't regard him as the sort of doctrinaire academic realist that many of us learn about in our college classes, but rather that he had sort of a realist persuasion. And I thought that the realist persuasion was the right way to think about the world. And when I mean a basically realist view of international politics, it's that states are the key actor in international relations. Yeah, there are other actors, but states are what really counts. That power, material power, is the key currency in their relations among each other, and that interest, defined somewhat narrowly, is the prime motive of state behavior. And I thought that this designation was in part accurate, given that he'd been associated with other foreign policy makers and administrations that seemed indisputably realist, particularly his time working for Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration. And I'll be curious as to what Jeff Engel or Bat think about this, but I would characterize the George H.W. Bush administration as basically a realist guided foreign policy team. And indeed, I attribute a lot of the good things in American foreign policy history to their being pushed by people from this basic approach. For example, the decision to wind down the Vietnam War, détente with the Soviet Union, the opening to the People's Republic of China, the decision at the end of the Cold War to negotiate German reunification with an attentiveness to the impact that that might have on the Soviet Union and then Russia, and the modest goals of the first Bush administration in the first Iraq War, or the Gulf War. And then finally, and most importantly, General Scowcroft's very perceptive, and I thought courageous, at least in terms of the courage of the foreign policy establishment, decision to make a public statement in the late summer of 2002, challenging the pretty much unchallenged consensus in the second Bush administration on behalf of a war to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Okay, so that's my view of Scowcroft, and I'm a realist, Scowcroft's a realist, I gotta like him. And I hope Jeff or Bat aren't gonna tell me that I'm wrong. But the second part of my remarks, I wanna talk about the paradox of foreign policy realism. And I think we realists, me sitting in my armchair, General Scowcroft actually doing real stuff that matters, are often right about a lot of big things. But I think we also very rarely get credit for being right. Now, in my case, because I labor in well-deserved obscurity, that's fine. But in the case of statesmen like General Scowcroft, I don't think that's so fine. And so the question is, why? And I want to make the argument. Again, remember, this is late. I'm not really normally provocative, but the last panel of the day, people are tired, and so you got to say something to really get them revved up. But I think part of the answer about why realists don't get the credit they're due is that we realists are in some sense un-American. Now think about that. I'm coming here on a panel to honor a great American, Brent Scowcroft, and I'm saying he's un-American. How could I make an argument like that? Well, first of all, the obvious and probably the most important evidence is most realists actually weren't American. Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Hans Morgenthau, these guys all spoke with an accent. QED, realism is un-American. But actually, I think there's an intellectually slightly more credible argument to be made. And the argument here has nothing to do with accents and everything to do with American political culture. I think America is a profoundly liberal society. Now, there's a second heresy, especially here in Aggie land. What do I mean by liberalism? I'm not talking about little L liberalism, Hollywood, Rob Reiner, ACLU, people like that. I'm talking about big L liberalism, the liberalism of John Locke, of Adam Smith, of the Baron de Montesquieu, classical liberalism, which the famous Harvard government professor Louis Hartz argued underscored the sort of vital center, that was Arthur Schlesinger, of American political culture. Key premises like a belief in the perfectibility of human nature through intelligent reason, the propensity of common interests to lead people to cooperate despite the lack of overarching institutions, and most importantly, the belief that democracy conferred unique advantages on democratic states. Now, if you accept that, we're all basically liberals, all of us except for General Scowcroft, Hans Morgenthau, Zbig Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger, and Mike Desch. All those names sort of go together naturally. The argument here is that realism challenges these liberal tenets directly. And think about it. The realists tend to have a very tragic view of human nature in contrast to the liberal view. Reinhold Niebuhr's work is sort of the classic articulation of this view that human nature is irredeemably flawed, and you have to operate in the real world with that recognition. Secondly, the belief that the anarchic nature of international politics is the most important feature of the relations among states, and that makes it a dog-eat-dog world, and you've got to just recognize that. International politics isn't going to be like domestic politics, although given the 2016 primary, domestic politics don't look so peaceful either. And then finally, the idea that democracies are special is something that most realists balk at. And we'll concede that living in a democracy is pretty peachy, and the domestic elements of democratic politics are quite laudable. But in terms of arguing that democracies behave differently in terms of foreign policy, we don't believe that. So, two key points here. One is that America's liberal tradition, this is what Hartz called it, is bipartisan, okay? And I would argue that, in fact, what you've seen since the end of the first Bush administration, really through the present, arguably, has been more consistency in foreign policy than inconsistency. So another sort of heterodox thing to say, that the first Clinton administration and the second Bush administration were in important ways on the same page. Two key things I would point to. One, the commitment to spreading democracy. If you go back and read the national security strategies of the Clinton administration, this is front and center. Well, surprise, surprise, it's the same thing in the Bush 43 administration. Secondly, the belief in a benign U.S. leadership is also a common thread between those two administrations. Now, I'll concede that there was some tactical differences between Clinton and Bush 43 in terms of how this leadership was exercised. The Bush administration was much more inclined to lead unilaterally. The Clinton administration was happy to have the fig leaf of multilateralism, but both were committed to the premise that a world without American leadership was going to go to hell in a handbasket. I would just say, if you haven't read the piece on Hillary Clinton and hawkishness in last Sunday's New York Times Magazine, you ought to take a look at it. She's actually further to the right on foreign policy than arguably at least one of the potential Republican candidates. Okay, so how could liberalism, big L liberalism, classical liberalism, produce this? And I argue that there's a dark side to America's liberal tradition. Lots of good things about it, but there are two elements of a dark side. One is it breeds in us an arrogance about our behavior in the world. We believe, because we're a liberal democracy, we can do no wrong. And indeed, we also believe, because we have good intentions in using our power, the rest of the world will see that we have good intentions and be happy to follow our lead. Secondly, the liberal tradition gives us predisposes us to a great fear of non-liberal political currents. And so we see all democracies as good. We see anybody that's not a democracy as bad. And this makes us inclined to think that if we don't remake the world in our image by spreading democracy, we're going to be in deep trouble. So let me just sum up real quickly. The late Princeton political science professor Bob Gilpin once famously said that no one loves a political realist. And given that, the challenge then is for those of us who think a realist-guided foreign policy would produce a better and more effective foreign policy is how to get around that basic fact. And it seems to me there are one of two arguments that we can make against the general political currents in our country. One I call the hangman's noose. And that's like, realism has been grudgingly accepted by the American public when it appeared to be of necessity. It was the only alternative. So, for example, it's no argument that the first, clear manifestation of realpolitik guiding an American administration would come at the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a period of parity or perceived parity with the Soviet Union. And so the idea that we'd have to make our peace with the Soviet Union, and by the way, that we'd also reach out to China to counterbalance a Soviet Union that had caught up to us in important ways, was more palatable simply because that was the hangman's noose. And one could argue that down the road, the prospect of the emergence of China as a potential rival hegemon could have a similarly salutary effect on us in forcing us to make our peace with the world the way it is rather than trying to remake it in our image. The second thing that we realists, I think, have to do is point out the follies of the liberal approach to foreign policy. And if you accept my argument about liberalism being sort of the default element of American political culture, there are a lot of decisions that have been made over the course of my lifetime that you can implicate the liberal tradition in, from Vietnam to Iraq. And so enlightened statesmanship, it seems to me, is the core of the realist approach, and why we're here to praise Brent Scowcroft, in my humble opinion, was that he epitomized enlightened statesmanship, a recognition of the world the way it is, rather than the world the way we wanted it to be, or he wanted it to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So now we're going to move across the prairie from the Department of Government. We've already had an opportunity to hear from Bartholomew before, but we're interested in your views on the legacy.
Thank you,
Brent
and
Scowcroft.
thanks again for having me here, and this is a wonderful occasion. I'm delighted to be here. In some ways, because Brent Scowcroft is not yet a household name, it's really too early to speak of his legacy, certainly not while he's still with us, but no doubt this is changing, and over time will change further. So let me just go over, I have a list of 10 points about how I think, well, what really sort of going from this sort of a macro of realism, although a touch of realism, to think about, well, what would his legacy be if I saw it from having just completed, of course, this biography. One is his role in history. You just heard about his role in the countering of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, so the eviction of Kuwait, of Iraq from Kuwait. We know about the reunification of Germany under NATO. And remember, this is at a time when 3/4 of the occupying powers were opposed to German reunification: Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. It was just Helmut Kohl and the United States who said, yes, we want reunification, and it has to be within NATO. And of course, as you heard too, this was crucial to the view that President Bush, Scowcroft, and indeed Baker and their staffs had of the role of the U.S. in the world. Also, Tiananmen Square in China. This is a time when there's a great deal of uncertainty. If you read about the events there, what the intelligence, what the State Department knows, there was talk about the Chinese leaders sending money overseas, having planes ready. It's not clear what the history was at the time or where it was going. And in that period, even though this maybe looks one-sided to some critics of the administration, the Bush administration, Scowcroft in particular, because of his longtime relationship with the Chinese, kept doors open, they kept talking, they kept this relationship going, and finally allowed in late 1992, in the spring of 92, I'm sorry, is for China to start this slow path on economic development and sort of as a player in the international system. So I think whether it's China, unification of Germany, end of the Cold War, where you have the collapse of an empire, as again with barely anybody being killed, and the control of the nuclear weapons and no revolutions or civil wars, this is extraordinary. So his role in all these things, if you look down at the record and what's going on, is you see that he's absolutely critical of these things. And this is not to take anything from Baker or Bush, because they are critical too, but he's certainly a key player. So historically. Secondly, and this you heard a great deal of today, as a national security advisor, as a policymaker, an advisor, and even political agent of the president. Not only an honest broker, and you know about the Tower Commission report, but also an advisor and confidant of the president, and really a jack of all trades assistant to the president. And as Mac Dessler, Ivo Dalder, David Rothkopf, John Burke, and others have written, he really is the exemplary national security advisor, and it's hard to imagine anyone, because of the circumstances in the team, replacing him as the gold standard. 3 is, I think this administration shows, the Bush 42, the importance of personnel and interpersonal chemistry. And this has been touched on before, but I think it gets to the point that you can have a star-studded administration, but if it's not well coordinated, if you don't have people in foreign policy, or for that matter, domestic policy, who are close to the president, who can trust each other, where you don't have the leaks, then it's very hard to get good policy. And here you have Scowcroft, who learned in this trial by fire during the very, very difficult Nixon and Ford years. And he learned from the Iran-Contra affair. He learned from being on the Packard Commission, from his time in the Pentagon,